December is a month of joy, lights, and celebration, but beneath the festive surface lies a darkness few dare to confront. As the nights grow longer and the cold settles in, whispers of eerie happenings surface, shadows that don't belong, footsteps crunching in empty snow, and secrets buried in frost. Did you ever wonder why the stillness of December nights feels so unnerving? Why the crunch of snow underfoot seems to echo louder when you're alone? These aren't just tricks of the mind. What lies hidden in the cold and darkness may haunt you forever. Join us as we dive into 15 disturbing true December horror stories that will chill you to the bone. If you enjoy spine-tingling tales that keep you up at night, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more haunting stories. Ryan leaned back in the old wooden chair, the glow of the fire painting shadows on the log cabin walls. The isolation was exactly what he'd wanted. Far from the chaos of the city, the cabin offered him peace, quiet, and time to finish the novel that had been eluding him for years. Outside, the first heavy snow of December was beginning to fall, muffling the world in a blanket of white. For 3 days, he'd settled into a rhythm, splitting firewood in the mornings, writing through the afternoons, and spending the evenings sipping coffee by the fire. But as the storm rolled in that evening, the peaceful solitude began to feel different. The silence wasn't calming anymore. It was oppressive. He tried to shake the unease, chalking it up to cabin fever. He was about to head to bed when a loud knock shattered the stillness of the night. Ryan froze, his pulse quickening. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and he hadn't seen anyone since he arrived. The knock came again, deliberate and heavy. Grabbing a flashlight, Ryan approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" he called out, his voice breaking the silence. No answer. He swung the door open, bracing himself for he didn't know what, but there was no one there. Only the howling wind and the snow swirling in the porch light. His flashlight beam caught something, footprints in the snow. They were deep, leading from the forest to his door, but no prints led back. His throat tightened. Whoever had knocked wasn't walking away. Ryan's eyes scanned the tree line, searching for movement, but the storm made it impossible to see far. He slammed the door shut, locked it, and pulled the curtain. "Just some lost hiker," he muttered, trying to convince himself. The next morning, the storm had eased, and Ryan decided to investigate. The footprints were still there, partially buried by fresh snow, but they stopped abruptly just a few feet from his cabin, as if whoever had made them had vanished. By afternoon, things started feeling off. His neatly stacked firewood had been disturbed, with several logs scattered on the ground. Inside the cabin, he swore he'd left his notebook on the table, but now it was on the floor. It wasn't until he found the journal that the unease turned to dread. It was wedged between the logs of the cabin's wall, old and weathered, the pages stiff with frost. Inside were frantic, scribbled notes. "The snow is alive. It waits for you to let it in." The final entry stopped him cold. "If you find this, don't trust him. He's not." That night the knock came again. Softer this time, but still deliberate. Ryan's heart pounded as he approached the door. He didn't want to open it, but the knocking continued, relentless. When he finally swung the door open, a man stood on the porch, shivering violently. His face was pale, his lips blue. "Please," the man rasped, "I'm lost. Let me in." Ryan hesitated, the warning from the journal ringing in his ears, but the man looked half dead. Against his better judgment, he opened the door wider. The man sat by the fire, huddling close to the flames, but no matter how long he sat, he didn't seem to warm up. His breath didn't fog in the cold air, and his movements were jerky, unnatural. He barely spoke, only muttering about the cold and how it doesn't let you go. Ryan's unease grew with every passing minute. When the man finally met his gaze, his eyes were hollow and too dark, as though they absorbed the light instead of reflecting it. At some point, the power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. Ryan lit a lantern, the flickering light casting eerie shadows. That's when he noticed the man wasn't sitting by the fire anymore. He found him by the window, staring out into the snowstorm. "What are you looking at?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. The man turned slowly, a grin spreading across his pale face. "You shouldn't have let me in," he whispered. Ryan's blood ran cold. He stumbled back, reaching for something. anything to defend himself. But when he looked up, the man was gone. The storm raged through the night, but Ryan didn't sleep. He sat in the corner, clutching the lantern, his eyes darting to every shadow. When dawn finally broke, the man was nowhere to be found. But as Ryan stepped outside, he froze. His breath caught in his throat as he saw the footprints in the snow. They didn't lead from the forest to his door this time. They led from his cabin into the woods. Inside, the journal lay open on the table. Only one line was written on the final page, in handwriting that wasn't his, "You're next." It was a quiet, frosty night in the suburbs, and Emily had just finished stringing up the last of her Christmas lights. Her young daughter, Chloe, was already fast asleep upstairs, and the house was filled with the soft glow of decorations. Outside, the snow-covered streets were still, illuminated by a pale moonlight that made everything look serene, almost magical. She sat on the couch with a cup of tea, scrolling through her phone, when a faint noise broke the silence. It was singing. At first, she thought it was a car radio, but the sound grew louder, distinct, a group of voices harmonizing to the tune of Silent Night. Emily stood, curiosity and unease mingling in her chest. She hadn't seen carolers in years. Pulling her sweater tight, she went to the window and peered through the curtain. There, standing on the edge of her front lawn, was a small group of people dressed in old-fashioned winter coats and hats, illuminated by the warm glow of her Christmas lights. Their faces were turned toward her house, and they sang with an almost mechanical precision. Something about them felt off. Their voices were too perfect, blending seamlessly as though they were a single entity, and their faces, though partially obscured by scarves and hats, seemed unnaturally still, even as they sang. Emily hesitated, then decided to open the door. The cold air hit her face as she stepped onto the porch. "Can I help you?" she called out. The carolers didn't respond. They continued singing, their heads tilted slightly in unison, their eyes, dark and expressionless, fixed on her. "Okay," Emily muttered, retreating back inside and locking the door. She peeked through the window again, hoping they'd moved on. But they were still there, standing motionless on her lawn, their song continuing as if on an endless loop. She felt a shiver run down her spine. Something wasn't right. She turned off the living room lights, hoping they'd think she'd gone to bed and leave. Hours passed. The singing never stopped. Emily tried to sleep, but the haunting melody followed her upstairs, seeping through the walls like it was inside the house. Frustrated, she went back to the window. The carolers were still there, but now their formation had changed. They were closer. Her heart raced as she stared at them. She hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen them move, but now they were standing at the edge of her driveway. She picked up her phone to call the police, but the line was dead. No signal, no Wi-Fi. A low creak echoed from upstairs. "Chloe!" Emily bolted up the stairs, her bare feet slipping on the hardwood. She burst into her daughter's room and found Chloe sitting up in bed, her small frame trembling. "Mommy," Chloe whispered, pointing toward the window. Emily's stomach dropped. The carolers were outside her daughter's window now, their faces pressed against the glass. The moonlight revealed their skin, too pale, too smooth, like porcelain masks. Their eyes, black and empty, stared unblinking into the room. She grabbed Chloe and backed away, clutching her tightly. "Stay here," she whispered, though her voice trembled. Emily ran downstairs to grab something, anything, to protect them. The singing grew louder, almost deafening, as she rummaged through a drawer and found a kitchen knife. When she turned around, they were at the front door. Their faces were visible through the frosted glass, distorted and inhuman. The melody warped, the harmony twisting into a guttural, haunting chant. The door handle jiggled. Emily screamed, running back upstairs to Chloe's room. She locked the door and pushed a dresser against it, clutching her daughter as the singing filled the house. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was worse. Hours passed before Emily worked up the courage to move. The sun had begun to rise, and the soft light of dawn spilled into the room. She crept downstairs, the knife still in her hand. The front yard was empty. The snow was undisturbed, pristine, as though no one had been there at all. But when she opened the door to check, something caught her eye. On the porch sat an old, weathered photograph. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The image was black and white, showing a group of carolers standing in front of a house. They were dressed in old-fashioned winter clothes, their faces unnervingly familiar. At the center of the group was a little girl. Her face was unmistakable. It was Chloe. Emily dropped the photograph, her breath hitching. A faint sound reached her ears, distant but unmistakable. They were singing again, this time from the woods. The highway stretched endlessly before Sam, a winding ribbon of asphalt cutting through the snow-covered mountain. He was exhausted, his eyes burning from hours of driving. The December storm had rolled in faster than he'd expected, and the once clear roads were now treacherous. Snowflakes whipped past his windshield like a curtain of static, and the faint glow of his headlights barely pierced the darkness. He cursed under his breath, wishing he'd stayed at the last motel. But the idea of spending another lonely night in a rundown room had pushed him forward. Now, miles from any town, the isolation pressed on him like a weight. As he rounded a curve, his headlights caught something, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. Sam's heart jolted, and he gripped the wheel tighter. It was a woman, dressed in a thin white dress that fluttered unnaturally in the wind. She wasn't wearing a coat or shoes, her long dark hair hanging limply around her face. Sam slowed the car, his gut twisting. What was she doing out here in the middle of a storm? He rolled down the window slightly, the icy wind biting at his skin. "Hey," he called out. "Are you okay? Do you need a ride?" The woman didn't move, her head tilted down as if she hadn't heard him. Sam hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong, but he couldn't just leave her there. With a sigh, he put the car in park and stepped out. The snow crunched under his boots as he approached her. "Ma'am?" he said, his voice softer now. She slowly raised her head, and Sam froze. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were sunken, lifeless. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that sent a chill racing down his spine. Sam stumbled back, his heart pounding. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but you need help. Let me take you somewhere warm." The woman took a step toward him, her bare feet sinking into the snow without leaving a mark. Sam's breath hitched. He turned and bolted back to his car, slamming the door and locking it. The woman was suddenly closer, standing just a few feet from his window. Sam fumbled with the gear shift, his hands shaking. The car lurched forward, tires spinning in the snow before gaining traction. He glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her fading into the distance, but she was gone. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. A cold breath brushed against the back of his neck, and his stomach dropped. "Why didn't you stop for me?" a voice whispered, chilling and hollow. Sam jerked the wheel, nearly skidding off the road as he looked into the rearview mirror. The woman was sitting in the back seat, her unblinking eyes locked on his. He slammed the brakes, the car sliding to a stop. Spinning around, he found the back seat empty. His chest heaved, panic clawing at him. "This isn't real," he muttered. "I'm just tired. That's all." The radio crackled to life, a static-filled rendition of an old Christmas hymn. Sam's shaking hand reached for the dial, but it wouldn't turn off. The melody grew louder, warped and dissonant. Then the woman's voice came through the speakers, soft but filled with malice. "You can't leave me here." The engine died, plunging him into silence. Sam's breath fogged the windshield as he sat frozen, too terrified to move. The only sound was the howling wind outside. The car lights flickered, and the radio buzzed again. The woman's voice returned, clearer this time. "Look behind you." Sam didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at him to keep his eyes forward, to not look. But the compulsion was too strong. Slowly, he turned his head. She was there, inches from his face, her lifeless eyes burning into his. Her mouth opened impossibly wide, and a deafening scream filled the car. Sam blacked out. When he woke, he was slumped over the steering wheel, the morning sun glinting off the snow outside. His car sat on the side of the highway, engine running smoothly. Shaking, he looked around. The back seat was empty, and there was no sign of the woman. For a brief moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare. Then he saw the frost on the inside of the windshield. 4 words were scrawled in long, jagged letters. "You should have stopped." Sam didn't finish his drive that day. He turned the car around and drove back to the city, vowing never to take that highway again. But no matter where he went, he could still hear her voice in the static whenever he turned on the radio. The farmhouse sat on a hill, surrounded by miles of snow-covered fields. It was quiet that Christmas Eve, just as it always was, but something about the silence felt unnatural this year. Emma had spent the evening alone, as she had every Christmas since her parents passed. The faint hum of the wind outside was her only company, as she sipped her tea and stared at the flickering glow of the fireplace. At exactly 10:23 p.m., the phone rang. Emma hesitated. No one ever called her this late. Rising from the couch, she crossed the creaky wooden floor and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" she said. The line crackled with static, but a voice came through, a voice she hadn't heard in years. "Emma, it's me. It's Dad." Her breath caught. "Dad? This isn't funny. Who is this?" "Emma, listen to me. You have to leave the house. Now, something is coming for you. Please, you have to trust me," the voice pleaded, filled with urgency. Emma's hands trembled. "This isn't possible. You're dead." The line went silent for a moment. Then, the voice returned, softer now. "I know, sweetheart, but I couldn't rest until I warned you. It's close. Don't stay to find out what it wants. Leave now." The line went dead. Emma stared at the receiver, her heart pounding. It had to be a prank, a cruel, elaborate prank. But deep down, something about the voice felt real, familiar. She hung up the phone and tried to shake off the unease. As she turned back toward the living room, she noticed something strange. The fire in the hearth, which had been crackling warmly just moments ago, was now completely extinguished. A faint chill seeped into the room. Emma rubbed her arms and grabbed a flashlight. The power flickered for a moment before plunging the house into darkness. She cursed under her breath and made her way to the kitchen, where she kept a box of matches. The phone rang again. She froze. The sound was deafening in the eerie silence. Reluctantly, she picked up the receiver. "Emma," the voice said, this time more frantic. "It's on the roof. Whatever you do, don't—" A loud thud interrupted the call. The sound came from above, heavy and deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth on the roof. Emma dropped the phone, her flashlight beam darting toward the ceiling. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came a screeching sound, like nails dragging across the shingles. Emma bolted to the front door, but when she reached for the handle, frost had formed over it, making it ice-cold to the touch. She glanced at the windows. Frost was spreading across the glass too, but in unnatural patterns, symbols and shapes that looked almost like writing. One of the windows shattered with a sharp crack, the sound echoing through the house. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it a voice, a whisper so faint it could barely be heard. "Emma!" She spun around, her flashlight catching a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. It was too fast to make out, but the air grew colder with each passing second. The frost on the windows now spelled out a single word: run. Emma didn't need another warning. She grabbed her coat and keys and made for the back door. Just as she reached it, a deafening crash shook the house. She turned to see the living room engulfed in flames, bright, unnatural flames that burned blue and white. The heat was intense, but the frost on the windows didn't melt. Instead, it seemed to thicken, the symbols glowing faintly in the firelight. Emma threw open the back door and ran into the snow, not stopping until she was far from the house. When she turned back, she saw the farmhouse consumed by fire, yet no smoke rose into the air. The flames didn't spread to the surrounding snow, as if they were contained by some invisible force. By the time the fire department arrived, there was nothing left but a smoldering pile of ash. The investigators found no signs of arson, no explanation for the strange blaze. But Emma knew. As she stood shivering in the snow, she noticed something on the ground near where the house had stood. Written in the frost that still clung to the earth were the same chilling words her father had spoken. "It's close." The house was filled with the warm glow of Christmas lights and the smell of pine needles. The Baker family had gathered for their annual tradition of decorating the massive tree in the living room. Emma, the youngest, carefully placed the final ornament, a delicate angel, at the top of the tree, while her older brother, Luke, strung the last garland of tinsel. As the family stood back to admire their work, Emma frowned. Something felt off. Amid the golden and silver decorations, there was one ornament she didn't recognize, a deep, blood-red glass sphere hanging low on one of the branches. "Who put this one up?" she asked, pointing to it. Her mother shook her head. "I've never seen that before." "Did one of you kids add it?" Luke shrugged, and their father dismissed it with a chuckle. "Maybe it's been in the box for years, and we just forgot about it. It looks nice, doesn't it?" But Emma didn't think it looked nice. There was something unsettling about its color. Too dark, too vibrant, almost like blood. That night, the house felt different. The festive atmosphere was gone, replaced by an uneasy stillness. Emma couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed until she finally decided to get up and get a glass of water. As she passed the living room, she froze. The red ornament was no longer where it had been. It was higher up now, hanging closer to the center of the tree. She blinked, certain she was imagining things, but when she stepped closer, she noticed something else. Her reflection in the glass was distorted. Her face looked twisted, her eyes darker and sunken. "Emma?" She jumped, spinning around to see Luke standing behind her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice groggy. "That ornament, it moved," she whispered. Luke rolled his eyes. "You're being ridiculous. It's just an ornament. Go back to bed." But the next morning the whole family noticed it. The red ornament was now at the very top of the tree, replacing the angel Emma had carefully placed there the night before. "I didn't move it," Emma said defensively. Her mother frowned, taking the ornament off the tree and placing it on the coffee table. "There. Now it won't bother anyone." But as the day went on, tensions in the house grew. Luke snapped at Emma over nothing. Their parents argued about the most trivial things, and even the dog growled at everyone who came near him. By evening, the arguments turned into shouting matches. Emma locked herself in her room, clutching a pillow to her chest as muffled voices echoed through the house. When she finally worked up the courage to go back downstairs, she saw that the living room was empty, and the red ornament was back on the tree. Her heart raced. She reached out to grab it, but as her fingers touched the glass, she felt a searing pain, like the ornament was burning her. She yanked her hand back and stared at the blistered skin on her fingertips. That night, she dreamed of the ornament. In her dream, it pulsed like a beating heart, dripping with blood. She saw her family arguing in the background, their faces distorted and unrecognizable. A voice whispered, low and menacing, "Do not break it." When she woke up, the house was silent. Too silent. She crept downstairs, calling for her family, but no one answered. The living room was empty, the Christmas tree standing dark and foreboding. The red ornament was now the only thing on the tree. Panic set in. Emma grabbed a fireplace poker and smashed the ornament with all her strength. The glass shattered, sending shards flying across the room. For a moment, she felt relief, until she realized the shards were reforming. Piece by piece, the ornament repaired itself, the glass shining even brighter than before. And then the whispers started. They came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the house. "You shouldn't have done that." The lights in the house flickered, and Emma felt a cold wind sweep through the room. The tree began to shake violently, the other ornaments crashing to the floor. The red ornament remained untouched, glowing ominously. Her family's voices echoed faintly in the distance, but they sounded wrong, hollow and twisted, like they were coming from far away. The next thing Emma remembered was waking up on the front lawn as snow fell softly around her. The house behind her was dark and silent, the windows coated with frost. The Baker family was never seen again. Years later, a new family moved into the house. In a box of old Christmas decorations, they found a single ornament they didn't recognize, a deep, blood-red glass sphere. The train cut through the snow-covered wilderness like a steel serpent, its headlights piercing the swirling flurry of white. Inside, passengers settled in for the long journey, cocooned in the warmth of the dimly lit cars. Outside, the storm raged, isolating them in a world of endless snow and shadows. Amelia sat near the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched the snow whip past. She hated traveling this close to Christmas, but she had no choice. Her grandmother's health was failing, and this was the only train that could get her to the remote mountain town in time. It was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful trip. But as the train slowed, the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're stopping temporarily due to snowdrifts on the track. Please remain seated while we wait for clearance." A collective groan filled the car. Amelia glanced out the window again. The snowstorm had worsened, but it wasn't the storm that caught her attention. It was the shadows. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, the way the snow seemed to play tricks on her eyes. But as she stared, she realized there were figures moving out there, just beyond the reach of the headlights. They were tall, impossibly thin, and shrouded in darkness. They didn't walk, but glided, their movements unnaturally smooth. Amelia blinked, pressing her face closer to the glass, but the shadows vanished. "Did you see that?" she whispered to the elderly man sitting across from her. "See what?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. "There were people out there, in the snow." He chuckled softly. "In this storm? You must be imagining things, dear?" Amelia wasn't convinced. She sat back in her seat, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave her. Minutes turned into hours, and the train remained stranded. Passengers grew restless, their complaints filling the air. Amelia tried to ignore them, focusing instead on her book, but she couldn't shake the sense that they weren't alone. Then she heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and coming from outside the train. She turned to the window, heart pounding. The shadows were back, closer this time. One of them reached a long, spindly hand toward the glass, tapping with fingers that seemed to stretch and warp as they moved. Amelia recoiled, her chair scraping against the floor. She looked around the car, but no one else seemed to notice. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. She bolted from her seat and headed toward the dining car, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But as she moved through the train, she noticed something chilling. Several seats were empty. At first, she thought the passengers had moved to another car, but their belongings were still there. Coats draped over chairs, suitcases tucked under seats. It was as if they had simply vanished. The tapping followed her, growing louder with each car she passed through. She reached the dining car, but it was empty too. Plates of half-eaten food sat abandoned on tables, steam still rising from coffee cups. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The only response was the wind howling outside and the tapping. Amelia's chest tightened. She turned back, intent on returning to her seat, but stopped in her tracks when she saw the shadows. They were inside the train now, their dark forms spilling into the corridor like smoke. She ran. Her footsteps echoed through the empty cars as the shadows pursued her. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel them closing in, the air growing colder with each passing second. Finally, she reached the rear car, slamming the door shut behind her. She pressed her back against it, her breath coming in ragged gasps. It was then she noticed the window. Through the frost-covered glass, she saw something buried in the snow outside. A hand. It was pale, frozen, and sticking up from the ground like a desperate plea for help. She wiped the frost from the window, revealing more of the scene. There were dozens of them, bodies half buried in the snow, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. And then she realized something even more horrifying. The clothes on the bodies. They matched the ones left behind on the train. A scream built in her throat as the shadows seeped under the door, reaching for her with elongated fingers. She grabbed the emergency brake lever and pulled with all her strength. The train lurched forward, the shadows retreating as the wheels screeched against the rails. Amelia collapsed to the floor, trembling. When the train finally reached the next station, Amelia was the only passenger left. The authorities found no evidence of the other passengers, no luggage, no belongings, no signs they had ever been there. But Amelia knew the truth. As the train pulled away, she stood on the platform, staring into the distance. In the snowbanks that lined the tracks, she saw them, the shadows, waiting patiently for their next stop. The holidays were in full swing at the Parker household. The tree sparkled with lights, stockings hung above the fireplace, and the scent of gingerbread filled the air. 8-year-old Sophie was especially excited. It was the first year her parents had bought her an elf on the shelf. "Remember, Sophie," her mom said as she placed the elf on the mantel, "he's here to watch and report to Santa. You better be on your best behavior." Sophie giggled, nodding. She named the elf Charlie and promised to keep him company. That night, as the family slept, Sophie woke to a strange sound. It was faint, almost like a child's laughter. She rubbed her eyes and looked toward the mantel, but Charlie was no longer there. She frowned and climbed out of bed, her tiny feet padding across the floor. The living room was dimly lit by the glow of the Christmas tree, and there, sitting on the couch, was Charlie. Mom must have moved him, Sophie muttered to herself, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning she told her parents about finding Charlie on the couch. Her dad raised an eyebrow. "We didn't move him, sweetie. Maybe you imagined it." But Sophie was sure. The following night the laughter returned, louder this time. Sophie stayed in bed, too scared to move, until morning. When she finally ventured downstairs, she found Charlie sitting at the kitchen table, a tiny cookie crumb on his lap. Her parents dismissed it as a prank, but Sophie swore she hadn't touched the elf. "Maybe he really is magic," she whispered. Over the next few days, Charlie began appearing in more unusual places. Once, he was perched on the bathroom sink, staring into the mirror. Another time, Sophie found him balanced on the edge of her bookshelf, his unblinking eyes fixed on her bed. The laughter grew louder each night, and Sophie began hearing faint footsteps, like someone small, scurrying across the floor. Her parents, growing uneasy, decided to put Charlie away. They tucked him into a box and stored it in the attic. But that night, Sophie woke up to find Charlie sitting at the foot of her bed. His painted grin seemed wider than before, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. She screamed, bringing her parents rushing in. They were stunned to see the elf there, certain they had locked him away. "It's just a toy," her dad said, though his voice wavered. He took Charlie outside and tossed him into the trash. For the first time in days, the house was quiet. Sophie slept soundly, believing the nightmare was over. But the next morning, Charlie was back. He sat on the mantel, in the exact spot where he'd first been placed. His grin was wider still, his eyes sharper, more menacing. The family decided to destroy him. Sophie's dad lit a fire in the backyard and tossed Charlie into the flames. They watched as the plastic melted and the cloth burned to ash. That night, Sophie felt safe again, until the laughter returned. She bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding. The sound wasn't faint anymore. It was loud, echoing through the house. She heard it coming from downstairs. Summoning her courage, she crept to the living room. The Christmas tree lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And there he was. Charlie sat at the base of the tree, completely intact. His grin stretched impossibly wide, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Sophie's parents woke to her screams, but by the time they reached her, she was gone. The only trace of her was a small pair of footprints in the snow outside, leading into the forest. The Parkers never found Sophie, though they searched for years. But every December, without fail, Charlie reappeared. He would sit on the mantel, his unblinking eyes fixed on the family, his grin a sinister reminder of what they had lost. And every December, they heard the laughter. The mountain lodge stood in isolation, buried deep within a forest blanketed by snow. It had once been a thriving ski retreat, but years of neglect had left it eerily silent, its charm now replaced by an unsettling stillness. For Mallory, it was a perfect escape. Her life in the city had grown overwhelming, and she craved the solitude the lodge promised. She'd booked the entire place for herself, thinking the silence would be soothing. But as she stepped out of her car and into the ankle-deep snow, she noticed something strange. The snow made no sound beneath her boots. There was no crunch, no rustle, just a profound, suffocating silence. The stillness stretched all around her, broken only by her soft breaths visible in the cold air. She shook off the unease, chalking it up to exhaustion, and headed inside. The lodge was cold and dark, the power flickering sporadically as the storm outside picked up. Mallory lit a fire and settled into a chair by the hearth, a cup of tea in hand. As she watched the snow fall outside the massive picture window, she couldn't help but notice how unnatural it seemed. The snow fell thick and heavy, yet there was no sound, no wind, no rustling of branches, just that suffocating silence. And then she saw them, footprints. They appeared suddenly, just outside the window, leading into the forest. Mallory's heart raced as she pressed her face closer to the glass. The tracks were fresh, crisp impressions in the untouched snow, but there was no sign of anyone making them. She grabbed her phone to call the lodge caretaker, but there was no signal. She paced the room, telling herself it was nothing. A trick of the light, maybe. When she looked back, the footprints had vanished. That night, she struggled to sleep. The silence pressed in on her like a weight, making her hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the old lodge. At some point, exhaustion overtook her, and she drifted off. She woke with a start to find the fire had gone out. The room was freezing, her breath forming clouds in the darkness. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and froze. Something was wrong. She could feel it, an oppressive presence in the room. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. The snow outside had stopped falling, but something else had appeared in its place. Snowmen. There were 3 of them, lined up in the clearing just beyond the lodge. They were crude, uneven shapes, with twigs for arms and small stones for eyes. Yet something about them felt alive. They seemed to be staring at the lodge. Mallory's pulse quickened. She locked the doors and shut the curtains, trying to convince herself it was just a coincidence, a leftover craft from other visitors. But as she lay back in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that the snowmen were watching her. The next morning, she reluctantly opened the curtains, hoping the daylight would dispel her fears. The snowmen were closer. They now stood just a few feet from the lodge, their features more defined. Their twisted twig arms pointed toward the window, their stone eyes unnervingly focused on her. Her first instinct was to leave. She packed her things in record time, but when she stepped outside, her car was buried under snow, the tires frozen in place. The silence was deafening. Even the sound of her boots crunching in the snow seemed to have been swallowed by the air. As she turned back toward the lodge, she noticed something even more chilling. The snowmen were gone. Her eyes darted around the clearing, scanning for any sign of them. The space where they had stood was empty, as if they'd never been there at all. That night, she barricaded herself inside the lodge, every door and window locked. She huddled by the fire, gripping a flashlight, her ears straining for any sound. And then it came. A faint thud, like something heavy hitting the roof. Mallory froze. The sound came again, louder this time. Thud, thud, thud. She shone her flashlight toward the ceiling, her heart hammering in her chest. The thudding stopped. Slowly, she crept toward the window, her breath shallow. She hesitated, then pulled back the curtain. The snowmen were back. They stood just outside the lodge, their faces pressed against the glass. Their stone eyes had been replaced with empty black hollows, their twig arms outstretched toward the window, and one of them was missing its head. Mallory screamed as the window shattered, the cold wind rushing in. The fire died out, plunging the room into darkness. In the morning, the lodge was found empty, the doors wide open. The only signs of Mallory were a set of footprints leading into the woods. They stopped abruptly in a clearing where 3 snowmen stood, perfectly still. One of them had a head that looked eerily like hers. The old mall on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for years, a decaying relic of the bustling holiday seasons it once hosted. Its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls made it a favorite haunt for urban explorers and thrill-seekers. That was why Ethan and his friends decided to check it out on a snowy December night. "It's just an empty building," Ethan said, shoving his flashlight into his backpack. "We'll take a few pictures and leave. Easy." The group of 4, Ethan, Mia, Jordan, and Emily, arrived at the mall just as the snow began to fall. The lot was desolate, blanketed in white, with their footprints the only marks disturbing the pristine surface. The entrance was easy enough to pry open, the rusted metal doors groaning as they stepped inside. Cold air and the faint scent of mildew greeted them. Their flashlights illuminated broken tiles, shattered glass, and dark storefronts with faded holiday decorations still hanging limply in the windows. "Creepy," Mia muttered, her voice echoing through the cavernous space. "It's just old," Ethan said, though his bravado was starting to waver. As they moved deeper into the mall, the snow outside seemed to muffle the world entirely. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the occasional creak of the structure. Then they heard it, faint music, like an old Christmas carol, distorted and scratchy as if played on a broken record. Emily stopped in her tracks. Is someone else here? No way, Jordan said, his flashlight darting around. It's probably just the wind or something. But the music grew louder, drifting toward them from the direction of the food court. Against their better judgment, they followed it. The food court was a shadow of its former self, with overturned chairs and rusting tables scattered across the floor. In the center of the space stood a large Christmas tree, its ornaments tarnished and its lights flickering erratically. Okay, that's weird, Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Who set this up? Ethan asked, taking a cautious step closer. The carol continued, a haunting rendition of Silent Night that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere. And then the lights on the tree blinked off, plunging the food court into darkness. What the hell? Jordan said, his voice shaking. Before anyone could respond, a loud clang echoed through the mall, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Their flashlights darted around, but they saw no one. We need to leave, Emily said, her voice trembling. But as they turned to go, they saw them, figures, barely visible in the dim light, standing in the shadows of the empty storefronts. They were motionless, their silhouettes unnaturally still. Who's there? Ethan called out, but the figures didn't move. Mia grabbed his arm. Ethan, let's go. The group backed away, their flashlights flickering as the figures seemed to multiply, stepping slowly into the light. They weren't people. The figures were mannequins, their plastic faces frozen in eerie smiles. Some were missing limbs. Others were draped in tattered clothes that looked decades old. They weren't here before, Jordan whispered. The mannequins began to move. It wasn't a natural movement. They jerked forward in sharp, unnatural steps, their heads twisting at impossible angles. The carol grew louder, distorted into a warped cacophony. Run! Ethan yelled. They bolted, weaving through the labyrinth of the mall, but no matter where they turned, more mannequins appeared. Some emerged from shattered display cases. Others seemed to materialize from the walls themselves. Emily tripped, and as Ethan turned to help her, he saw one of the mannequins lurch forward, its hand reaching for her ankle. He pulled her up, and they sprinted toward the exit. When they finally burst outside, the snowstorm had intensified. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, panting and covered in frost. But as they drove away, Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. The mannequins stood in the parking lot, lined up in rows, their blank faces turned toward the car. The group never spoke about the incident again, but they all knew one thing. The mall wasn't empty. Something else was there, waiting in the shadows. Weeks later, a local news report mentioned a group of teenagers who had gone missing after entering the mall. Ethan and his friends stayed silent, but when Ethan walked past his living room window one night, his heart stopped. A single mannequin stood in his front yard, its smile somehow wider than before. The church at the edge of town was a thing of beauty in the snow. Its tall spire reached toward the gray winter sky, and the sound of its bells echoed over the frozen fields every Sunday. Built in the 1800s, it was known for its grand stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes in vibraniers. For Clara, the church was a refuge. After losing her parents the year before, she often found herself wandering its empty halls, seeking solace in its quiet. One particular December evening, with the snow falling softly outside, Clara stayed later than usual. The Cariti BD 268 roughed the stained glass, painting the pews in shades of red, blue, and gold. She knelt at the altar, her breath visible in the cold air, and closed her eyes. Please, she whispered, her voice trembling, help me find peace. When she opened her eyes, the church was dark. The sun had fully set, and the only light came from the moon shining through the windows. She glanced at her watch and sighed. It was later than she thought. As she turned to leave, she heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps on stone. Hello? Clara called, her voice echoing in the empty space. No response. She frowned and walked toward the back of the church, where the sound seemed to have come from. The air grew colder with each step, and her breath came out in thick clouds. She reached the heavy wooden doors, only to find them shut tight. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Her pulse quickened. She turned to head toward the side exit, but froze in her tracks. The stained glass windows were glowing. It wasn't the soft glow of moonlight, but something brighter, almost like the light of a candle. Each figure in the windows seemed to shimmer and pulse with life, their faces shifting slightly. Clara took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. She rubbed her eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light. And then the figures moved. At first, it was subtle, a hand lowering, a head tilting. But soon, the figures began to step out of the windows, their vibrant colors melting into three-dimensional forms. Clara stumbled backward as one of them, a robed figure holding a staff, stepped onto the stone floor. Its face was no longer serene. Its eyes burned with a cold, unnatural light, and its mouth twisted into a sneer. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice hollow and echoing. Clara turned and ran, her footsteps pounding on the stone floor. She darted down a side aisle, glancing over her shoulder. More figures were emerging from the windows, angels with cracked halos, saints whose expressions had turned menacing. She reached the side door and shoved it open, spilling into the snow-covered courtyard. She didn't stop running until she was halfway down the hill, the church looming behind her like a shadow. But when she looked back, she saw them. The figures stood in the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. Their glowing eyes followed her as she fled into the night. Clara never returned to the church, and she avoided its bells, which seemed to toll more frequently after that night. Months later, the caretaker found her key in the snow outside the door. When he looked up at the stained glass windows, he could have sworn the faces were different. One of them looked just like Clara. The village of Frost Hollow was known for its brutal winters and its peculiar tradition, a festival called the Lantern Walk. Every December 22nd, the villagers would light lanterns and hang them outside their homes, creating a golden glow that illuminated the icy streets. According to legend, the Lantern Walk was a way to ward off the Night Wanderer, a sinister spirit said to roam the village during the longest nights of the year. No one had seen the Wanderer in decades, but the tradition persisted, passed down from generation to generation. For Hannah, a newcomer to Frost Hollow, the festival felt charmingly quaint, if a bit odd. She had moved to the village to escape the chaos of city life, renting an old cottage at the edge of town. When her neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Winslow, knocked on her door to deliver a lantern, Hannah laughed. "This is so sweet," she said, holding up the delicate glass lantern. "But I don't really believe in ghosts." Mrs. Winslow's expression turned grave. "It doesn't matter if you believe," she said. "The Wanderer will come either way. Keep your lantern lit." Hannah smiled politely and placed the lantern on her porch, but she couldn't shake the unease in the old woman's voice. The night of the festival arrived, and the village transformed. Lanterns glowed on every porch, their warm light reflecting off the snow. Children ran through the streets, their laughter echoing in the crisp air, while adults huddled together, sharing stories and mulled cider. Hannah wandered through the village, marveling at the beauty of it all. But as the hours passed and the villagers retreated indoors, a strange stillness fell over Frost Hollow. By midnight, the streets were empty, the only sound the occasional creak of a lantern swaying in the wind. Hannah returned to her cottage, her cheeks red from the cold. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the snow fall. The glow of her lantern was comforting, a small beacon in the darkness. Then the light flickered. She frowned and stood to check the lantern. The flame inside was steady, burning bright. But as she turned to go back inside, she saw them. Footprints in the snow, leading up to her porch. Her heart raced as she looked around. The footprints stopped just short of the lantern, as if whoever, or whatever, had left them had turned away. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. The wind howled, and for a moment, Hannah thought she saw a shadow move at the edge of the forest. Shaking her head, she stepped back inside and locked the door. She tried to sleep, but a strange unease kept her awake. Every so often, she would glance out the window, expecting to see someone, or something, standing outside. And then it happened. The lantern went out. Hannah bolted upright, her breath catching in her throat. She grabbed her coat and flashlight, determined to relight it. But when she opened the door, the lantern was gone. Her porch was empty, except for a single trail of footprints leading into the woods. Against her better judgment, she followed them. The snow crunched softly beneath her boots. the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The footprints led deeper and deeper into the forest, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels. "Hannah!" The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it froze her in her tracks. "Hannah!" It came again, closer this time. Her flashlight flickered, and she spun around, shining it into the trees. Shadows danced on the snow, but there was no one there. And then she saw him. The figure stood just beyond the reach of her light, tall and impossibly thin, his face obscured by a hood. His body seemed to shimmer, as though it were made of the very shadows that surrounded him. The Night Wanderer. Hannah stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure took a step forward, and she could feel the air grow colder, biting into her skin like needles. She turned and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she retraced her steps. The trees seemed to close in around her, the shadows stretching and twisting unnatural. When she finally burst out of the forest, she didn't stop running until she reached the village square. The lanterns were all extinguished. The next morning, the villagers found Hannah's cottage door wide open, snow drifting in across the floor. Her footprints led back to the forest, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Some say the Night Wanderer claimed her that night, adding her to the shadows of the woods. Others believe she's still out there, wandering endlessly, her lantern light flickering faintly in the distance. Every year after, the villagers hung their lanterns earlier and kept them burning longer, but no one dared to go near the edge of the forest, where the snow always seemed darker and the shadows never quite stayed still.